Is the King's Room open for tomorrow?
Good evening. You always have to check and make sure the tech is doing the techy thing that it's supposed to be doing. Yes, we're on. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I serve here at AST as president, and it is good to have you all with us here. Atlantic School of Theology is located in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Beginning in 1725, the Mi'kmaq, along with the Passamaquoddy and the Wolastoqiyik peoples, signed a series of peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown. These treaties did not deal with surrender of land, but rather set out conditions for the sharing of resources between sovereign nations. We want to pause to acknowledge their presence in this place from time immemorial and to give thanks for their stewardship and their hospitality, which allows us to learn and worship and serve in this place. I invite you to join me for prayer. Gracious Spirit, as we come together in this place of learning, we ask for your presence among us. Bless Pam, our speaker, with clarity and insight, and open our hearts and minds to new ideas. May this time inspire curiosity, foster understanding, and ignite a passion for knowledge. Let us engage with respect and compassion, embracing the diversity of thought that enriches our community together. The Nicholson Lectures were established by a fund that began in 1981 in memory of Dr. Clarence M. Nicholson. Dr. Nicholson was principal of Pine Hill Divinity Hall from 1946 to 1971. We belong to him. I don't intend to be here. He also served the United Church of Canada as moderator for 2 of those years in the early 1950s. These lectures are to focus on the field of pastoral theology as a permanent tribute to the last principal of Pine Hill, who was an integral part of the work of the formation of Atlantic School of Theology here in this place. And it is my privilege to welcome our Nicholson lecturer for 2024. Pamela McCarroll serves as the Jane and Geoffrey Martin Chair in Practical Theology at Emmanuel College, the Toronto School of Theology, the University of Toronto, or in the Victoria University as well. She joined the faculty at Emmanuel in 2016 after teaching in the area of pastoral theology for several years at Knox College, and prior to that serving as a spiritual care educator and director at hospitals in Toronto and Hamilton. Pam's major research and teaching areas focus on the lived experience and possibility of hope in contexts of suffering. She is concerned with the intersections of suffering and hope in shaping healthy practices and life together as communities and as global citizens. Her latest research focuses on the climate crisis and practical theology, which is the area she'll be addressing this evening and again tomorrow. She is recognized for her leadership in this field, and she also teaches and publishes on interreligious spiritual care, chaplaincy, spirituality and health, interreligious spiritual care education, and methodology in practical theology. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela McCarroll?
Hello, it is so good to be among you. Thank you so much to you folks present and then online. Where do I look for the online folks? Okay. Yes, welcome. Really good to be here. And thank you for the incredible hospitality. There's so many to thank, and I'll probably do that more fulsomely tomorrow night. I do want to bring the greetings from Emmanuel College and from Principal Hiran Craig, the principal where I serve, and your sister theological school in Toronto. I also was learning a little bit more about Dr. Nicholson as I was preparing for these lectures, and discovered that he actually received an honorary doctorate from Victoria University, where I served. So that was quite exciting to hear that. And I'm continuing to learn about that. I think Principal Kim Craig mentioned that one of his sermons is in a forthcoming book of sermons, United Church sermons, that will be published shortly. So before I get started, I want to say a few words about some of the content at the beginning, because there's going to be some heavy content. We're dealing with a difficult topic right now. So I just want to name that. We can't easily pretty it up. And one of the things when I'll be talking more about hope tomorrow is we can't just sort of pretty up hope. People have lots of criticisms about hope, but so how do we take seriously the situation that we're in right now and try to understand what hope might look like without defaulting to things like denial or something like that. So I am naming some of the challenges of the climate crisis at the beginning fairly heavily, right? And so I just invite you to pay attention. You might find yourself responding or feeling different feelings, or there may be bodily sensations, all these things that can come when we feel a sense of threat about these some of the realities that we may be facing or are facing. So, and I invite you to just be compassionate with yourself and notice those, because part of that is what we'll be talking about, some of the ways that naturally happens to us, and the ways that can be challenging for us, but also a way that we can find our way through to a new way. Tonight we'll be talking of faithfulness. So, I'm in charge of the PowerPoint. Okay. There we go. So tonight I'm going to start with describing climate trauma, climate anxiety, and eco-anxiety. Then I'll do a few ponderings, theological ponderings growing out of that, and then think about what does faithfulness look like today? What are ways that we can respond faithfully? And what are places we can turn to for some inspiration about that? So this is an image that has lots of different things going on, from floods and fires, or drought, to species extinction, melting ice, coastal erosion, hurricanes and storms. Climate change is already having a big impact on Canada, on Canada's communities and landscapes and farms and wildlife. So tonight I invite you to consider your own experience of climate change, both what you've experienced yourself here, living in Halifax and nearby, because there have been many incidents here that have been connected with climate change, and also just what your anticipation in terms of the future. We will be thinking about this and trying to be aware of how our bodies respond and our emotions respond to this. When I think about the flooding and the fires and the drought and the large snows that Halifax has been having over the last couple of years, there's a lot that's been happening. We think about the fires that were happening out west and how that smoke spread so much across the continent, and the kind of fear that that engendered in people. Both for those who have lived through some of these things and experienced these climate incidents really severely, and for those who hear about them on the news all the time, right? It can bring up all sorts of different emotions. So pay attention to what your own emotions are related to climate change. I invite you to do that tonight. This past summer, I had the privilege of taking an incredible week-long holiday in Jasper, Alberta. Little did we know when we left that within 8 days of our leaving this incredible place, the town would be evacuated and the wildfires would destroy much of the town, along with the forested mountainsides, the animals, all of the areas where we trod and where people lived and the community thrived, and even the cabin where we stayed were burnt to the ground. It was devastating to take in and overwhelming. Watching the news of the destruction sent my body into a kind of unnerving panic, like a gopher or a marmot might be, running trying to find a place to hide. My stomach knotted, my throat constricted, my chest buzzed, and my brain jumped around trying to figure out what I could do. And I'd wander around, I tried to pray, and it was sort of like not being able to find the words. What do you pray? It was kind of this scanning and overdrive and checking the TV and the news and the radio to see if there was more news. What words could be uttered in the face of such loss and devastation? And I was just seeing it from a distance. I wasn't living those losses in the way that people living there were, and the animals living there were as well. As we know, that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they put out reports every few years. And last year they put out a report referencing an earlier report. So the IPCC highlighted in 2018 the unprecedented scale of the challenge required to keep warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. And 5 years later, in 2023, that challenge has become even greater due to a continued increase in greenhouse gas emissions at a pace and a scale, given what's been done so far. So the current plans are insufficient to tackle the climate change that is before us. So even since the IPCC started doing the reports and we're trying to keep us at 1.5 degrees, that's looking less and less possible. They note in this report as well that often the least responsible, those people who are least responsible for climate change are the ones who are most deeply affected by it. This next slide is a difficult one, but I'm just going to touch into it a bit just to set the stage. Brian McLaren is a theologian and has recently published a book called Life After Doom. And one of the things he does is he does a lot of looking at science and a lot of the work of social scientists and scientists around climate change and what might happen. And so he identifies 4 possible outcomes that we may be looking at in terms of the future. And none of them are easy. None of them are easy. But the first one is called, he calls collapse avoidance. So in this case, he describes that our civilization will continue to destabilize Earth's life support systems, and failing life support systems will continue to destabilize the civilization. There will be this downward spiral where the environment and the civilization will feel that very deeply, but enough leaders and citizens will wake up with sufficient urgency, unity, and wisdom to transform where we're going and to learn to live within the limits that we have. So that's the best scenario. The other 3 all really talk about a collapse happening and then either rebirth happening from a remnant group of people that may be left, and then there's also the possibility of just survival, but it would be like pre-modern times, yet the landscapes would be so inhospitable to humans, it would be hard going. And then there's the concern about extinction. So all of them are difficult, right? But these are the 4 that he puts out there. As we continue on the trajectory we're going. So I'm aware that this is heavy material, and through his book when he's doing this, and the audio book too, he's constantly reminding us to be gentle with ourselves when we hear this kind of information. Pay attention to what it brings up in us. Tough scenarios, all of them. So how does this play out? So that's the big picture. then we see how this plays out in our human lives now as we're living. So it's really interesting to see how worldwide there is an increase in ecosystem distress syndrome, so the fact that ecosystems are suffering, right, which is matched by a corresponding increase in human distress syndromes. So there's this link between the ill health of the planet and the mental health challenges of humans who are part of the planet, right? It's not a surprise that in fact there's this deep connection between humans' mental health and planetary health. So these links are being very clearly established, and the American Psychological Association in particular has been spending quite a bit of time pondering this and the effects of this. There have been some incredible studies actually done around youth, with youth and young adults, or particularly around their experience of eco-anxiety. So the connections between planetary health and human health. Again, not surprising. Mental health in particular. And there's this expanding taxonomy, so different terms to talk about these experiences. So eco-anxiety is one, but there are all these other ones too. I'm only going to be focusing on eco-anxiety and climate trauma today, but solastalgia, climate grief, Tierra trauma, so new words are being created to sort of tap into some of what's going on. So eco-anxiety, these are two distinct, eco-anxiety and climate trauma are two distinct but related phenomena, and I'm going to go into those right now. But it is, in particular, you probably have youth in your life or young adults in your life where this is actually very much in their minds, but also more widely among many of us here. So eco-anxiety. Psychospiritual pain caused by climate crisis. So that's the broad definition. Acute or chronic fear of environmental doom, another definition that comes up for it. One of the things about eco-anxiety is that it can exacerbate other conditions, but it is also important to recognize it's adaptive. So when we say adaptive, it means it reflects a normal response to a very distressing reality. You know, we don't want to pathologize this and say this is wrong. In fact, at some level, the fact that humans are experiencing this reflects their connection with the earth and their sensitivity and awareness, even on a bodily level of that. So some of the language that would be associated with eco-anxiety or climate trauma would be radical futurelessness, which Robert Lifton used. This idea of there can be a certain level of anxiety that can be motivating, right? Stress can be motivating, right? But then when it moves into distress, it can trigger defense mechanisms. And the defense mechanism can be things like blame or anger or avoidance or denial or shutting down. So this is where it turns into what people are calling, or we're calling climate trauma as opposed to eco-anxiety. It's sort of a different level when these defense mechanisms start being activated. So the challenge is, how do we maintain equilibrium enough so that there's the energy of eco-anxiety that can be very adaptive and a positive thing without triggering into these other climate trauma responses? How can it energize us rather than shut us down from facing waves, right? And that we'll be spending more time thinking about hope tomorrow and thinking about faithfulness tonight, but just want to make that distinction. So climate trauma. So it's seen as, it can compound other traumas. It's seen as a different order of trauma. So when we talk about trauma, often it's a passing thing. So it's something that happens. Sometimes it's intergenerational. We would have heard of intergenerational trauma, but so it's often relationship-based. This climate trauma is kind of a larger category of trauma. And the challenge is it's ever present and it's ever growing, right? It's not like a passing thing that people would experience at So some of the definitions or understandings here would be an increase in shock and post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded stress, anxiety, substance abuse, and depression. So it's an acute sort of way of understanding climate trauma. And then a chronic form of it would be an increase in aggression and in violence, mental health emergencies, increased sense of helplessness, hopelessness, or fatalism, intense feelings of loss. So all of those experiences come along with climate trauma. And to dig into a little bit more, think about, so the climate crisis sort of functions as this, when you use trauma theory to interpret this and to interpret it with us individually but also collectively, the climate crisis is the precipitating stressor. Not everybody's going to react to it, but it is a precipitating stressor that triggers protective stress or trauma responses, right? So that is the threat. So something threatens us and then we react. That can be what happens. So what happens? The individual and public expressions of that can come out in all these different ways: denial, skepticism, indifference, rage, fear, addiction, distraction. It's like our trauma response is a protective response. It's trying to protect us from the threat. So that's the way it's functioned. When we want that kind of thing to happen when we are running from a bear, a grizzly bear or something, or trying to find safety, right? These sort of protective ways. We're playing dead, right, to keep ourselves safe. So it's a way that we humans tend to react in the face of an overwhelming threat. And you may have heard about this before, the sort of fight, flight, freeze response. I've added in fright too, but the fight, flight, freeze sort of survival response to this kind of precipitating trigger, this threat of climate change. So we can see this, the fight response. Some see it in polarized political discourse, in reactive denial of climate change, in anger and rage or public blaming and shaming, this kind of way of the fight response. So it's, again, this idea of big threat and then the reaction to it. Or a flight response, like, I don't want to think about it, I'm turning away from that, I'm going to be distracted. I know this one myself. Most of us will be familiar with some of these ourselves, right? I know this one. I can't think about it anymore. I need to distract myself with something else, right? Dissociation, or the freeze response. Some describe that there's this sort of collective dissociation where we freeze, we kind of disconnect and become indifferent to what's going on, and it's a part of a freeze response or a dissociative response that some eco-psychologists are describing. And then the fright response, when it turns, the stress turns into overwhelming distress, so it can be in bouts of panic or sleeplessness or an elevated heart or obsessive kinds of thoughts. So there are all these different ways that it can play out. The big thing is that trauma responses like this are full-bodied experiences that involve our thoughts and our emotions and our nervous and limbic systems. So we can pick this up probably in ourselves and those around us, how this might play out, right? And I mean, we're living in a time, some would say, of polycrisis. It's not just the climate crisis, there are other crises. And so how some of these dynamics play out societally and then in families as well. Peter Levine, who's a very well-known trauma theorist and therapist, describes that if trauma reactions aren't discharged from the body, then that blocked energy remains trapped in the nervous system, and it tends to become cyclical and gets worse and worse. So it needs to be released somehow. And not necessarily released in rage or blaming or shaming or a fight response that feels like, we just gotta get it out there. So one of the challenges with this is these kind of acute responses actually feed into this cycle of making things worse, because it's like we're too scared to see the threat for what it is. We're busy reacting, And then we continue business as usual and don't kind of engage as we might otherwise engage, and then it sort of becomes cyclical. So even as these trauma responses are coming out, and my slide says here, serving an important protective purpose in human survival, in the context of the climate crisis, it's like they contribute to the crisis. They turn in on themselves. They're not functioning, but you can get stuck in these cycles. This is another slide. It sort of gets at the same thing. So if we start like the increase in climate events on the far left, that triggers a trauma response, right? That causes people to turn away from the crisis in different ways of reacting. It causes inaction regarding climate crisis or just needing to just deny it or whatever, which causes an increase or contributes at least to an increase in climate events. You see how it can become cyclical, right? And sort of feed in on itself. So this is sort of a way, this is where we're starting, a way of interpreting and reading what's going on and some of the human dynamics at play in the face of the climate crisis. I'd like to turn now and spend a little bit of time to think theologically about some of these dynamics, and then we'll move into sort of what does it look like to live faithfully these days without falling into some of these reactive ways of being. Theological musings. I'm calling these two. There's a couple slides here. So the reality of eco-anxiety or climate trauma kind of highlight the paradox of the human condition. So on the one hand, we're finite, vulnerable creatures. And that can be a fearful thing, right? Just that in itself can be a fearful thing. And on the other hand, we see that we have a vast capacity for self and other destruction. And this is a really complicated paradox to hold in tension. It's not all we are, but these two realities are there, and they feed into this whole cycle potential of kind of trauma. So the first point emphasizes our dependence, our interdependence upon other species and humans, and ultimately on the Creator, who Christians, we believe, has given us life. So that's the first point. The second point emphasizes theologically at least our capacity for sin, right? But when we use a trauma lens on the second point here, we can perceive the ways our capacity for violence and destruction, our capacity for sin, is related to the depth of our vulnerability and our dependence, and our fear of this precarity, our fear of our precariousness, and so we, react. The need to protect ourselves from even sensing the threat of our precarity and our vulnerability sort of triggers all this way of acting in this destructive way of being. And as creatures who are mortal yet have been given the gift of self-consciousness and thought, we can think about our mortality. And when our mortality scares us and is not embraced through different means, through spiritual, theological framings, through practices, through communities, it can turn us in on ourselves into these protective reactivities that can take over. So this is a primary conundrum in human, I would say. Not just within the climate crisis in general, but it does come to the fore when we use this sort of trauma lens to interpret some of the behaviors we see in the face of the climate crisis. So a question here for me is, what does it mean to embrace our vulnerability as a gift of our earthiness and a gift of our creature? The second theological pondering I want to bring forward is how the climate crisis at some level reflects a deep spiritual crisis for humans, a kind of disorientation from our God-made earthiness, the way we were intended to be with and upon the earth. alienated from Earth's creatures and processes, and a bit of a confusion about the meaning and purpose of human life. So I raised the question, what does it mean to be Earth creatures intimately woven in the depths of the earth, as Psalm 139 says? So this is a common way of thinking about the climate crisis as a deep spiritual crisis within humans. The whole question of how our incapacity to embrace our vulnerability, our earthenness, and instead our desire or our feeling to control or to make the earth serve our needs as if it's there for our using and our taking, right? It's a very different way of thinking about how we are human in this world. So what does it look like, called to be human? Doug Hall, who was a mentor of mine and teacher, always said, we're called to be human, no more and no less. Powerful sort of way of thinking about no more and no less. So these are two sort of theological reflections on our whole as we move into thinking about what faithfulness might look like. I'll go through 4 or 5 different calls to faithfulness. The first one, called to faithfulness, fear not. This whole, in the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures in the Newer Testament, there are 365 places where it says, fear not, or, do not fear. And usually these are said in contexts where, yes, there are powers of death and destruction that hold sway in this context, and still the call is, do not fear. Do not fear. So to hear these words and this kind of framing spoken into the depths of our beings invites us to release the hold of fear and that threat in the context of climate change. Yes, there is the threat of death and destruction. There's no getting away from that at this point. However, we don't need to get into the trauma reactivities around that. We can hear that call to fear not deep into our souls and to sort of begin there, to try to reclaim what it might look like to be creatures called to, we'll get to this shortly, but called to tend and to keep the earth. So to fear not. The song that so powerfully comes to me now is Psalm 46, certain parts of Psalm 46 in the context of climate change. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with tumult. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. We will not fear. And the Psalm 23, I have this part of it here, but there's another part of it that's even more telling. But even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and the staff, they comfort me. Earlier in the Psalm 2, it talks about, besides still waters, restores my soul. All these earthen images are given. The connection of humans with the earth is what restores the soul. And Jesus, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. So how do we really hear this into our beings? The first stage in trauma recovery is to find a sense of safety. Like that is key. When people are in therapy or whatever, it's that they have to find a way of safety and keeping themselves safe. And this to me speaks into that so deeply, because the scriptures were written in very troubled times with all sorts of trauma going on. right? And the fact that the repeated call to fear not is so central can speak to us today. So, reframing climate emotions as divine invitations to embrace our creaturehood. So what I want to get at here is that as creatures made of the dust of the earth, when creation groans and longing, we feel this within our bodies. So the fact that we actually feel and experience this signifies something very deeply true about how connected we are, how much we are earthly creatures, and it's something we can turn to and run to as opposed to be fearful of, the kind of emotions that might come up. As the earth is in pain, we too will be in pain. At some level, it signifies this sense of belonging and compassion and connection and love woven within. So I kind of think about eco-anxiety, especially eco-anxiety before it's gone into that reactive kind of space, is being in right relation. And I come out of sort of the Presbyterian tradition where right relation is a very important thing. How do we become in right relation, right? And there's something about that that actually reflects something that's very important and good at this time. If we can mobilize it, help it mobilize us to respond. I don't know if any of you have read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Malkimmer. Yes, okay, I draw on her a lot. But one of the things she talks about is how, she has a quote about the smell of humus, so earth, soil, the smell of humus has a physiological effect on humans, she writes. Breathing the scent of Mother Earth, she says, stimulates the release of oxytocin, a love chemical. That is the same that is released when a parent is bonding with a child. Right? So this sense of our embodied connection with the earth and this release of oxytocin. So it sort of reflects that same way of thinking about ourselves. So if we can embrace some of our emotions and our sadness and our grief and not be scared of it, space may open, a pathway may open forward. And we'll get into this more tomorrow, but the whole sense of being fed by the earth and how deeply we can be fed by the earth, how our whole bodies change when we spend time within nature. We probably know that intuitively, right? But there's something very intrinsic about being human that we're experiencing in our lives. This is a big one. And this sort of responds to that spiritual crisis that climate change reflects. So, Genesis, there's lots done on Genesis, and I'm only going to pop into a few things. But, you know, the creation stories and a lot of biblical scholars who are looking at it through sort of the earth-centered lenses are just discovering all sorts of interesting things in Scripture. So in Genesis chapter 1:27, there's the passage that we were all probably familiar with, that God created humans in God's own image, right? So this idea of imago Dei, the image of God, humans as the image of God. Well, of course, that's a bit of a complicated history, right? Because it depends on how we think about God and what our images of God, how that is imaged, right, in relation to our call as humans. So, and our relation with the earth. So if God is imaged as one of control and mastery and wielding power over the earth, then the human image will be similar, right? And we see that this has been a common image without Western Christianity and colonialism and all the violence that has come out of that, has been a part of this kind of imaging of God and humans coming in as masters and those who take over and very different image than some of the other images in Genesis. But if we have an image of God revealed in Jesus, as one whose power exists not in control, but in a vulnerable capacity to love, to forgive, for justice, to not seek revenge, as one who calls forth life and wholeness, and whose gift is to heal and to draw forth the beauty of others. If we imagine that that's the revealing of God, and that's the imaging of God we're called to, it's a very different kind of way of being in the world that is intimate. One of the European reformers in the 16th century, John Calvin, had a way of interpreting this passage as mirroring. We're called to be mirrors or image God. So image as a verb, so we're invited to image and reflect God's love in the world, right, as reflectors of that. So reflecting God's love as a part of our vocation and what it means to be human. The other piece in Genesis 2, there's a lot more, there's the subdue and dominant. I'm not going to get into that, but there have been ways people have been reinterpreting that passage too. But I'm going to move into Genesis 2, 15, and to tend and to keep the earth. So again, how this invitation to tend and keep the earth, that has something very important to say about what our vocation is, our call is as human beings. So how might we rediscover our vocation as earthen creatures, as God loved earthen creatures, through these kinds of motifs and through tending, this call to tend and keep the earth. A couple more here. And then there are so many scriptural passages and stories that talk about horrific things happening and people being called to life and to love and to continue on even in the face of endings. So I've chosen one, but there are many of them. So how might we follow our ancestors in the faith who faced many endings to life as they knew it? This passage is from Jeremiah, chapter 29, verses 1 to 14. And the context is, it's the end of the holy city. Jerusalem has been completely destroyed. The displacement of the Jewish people. The wealthy and educated have either been killed or sent into captivity. The farmers have been left to toil for the empire and to build up the coffers of the colonial powers, and the poor are enslaved. And this is what Jeremiah is calling them to. Calling the people to build homes and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce, have children, seek the welfare of the city, and pray to God on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. For surely I have plans for your welfare and not for your harm, to give you a future of hope. When you call on me, I will hear you. So amidst these powers of death and destruction, God calls people to stay committed to life, to planting and tending their gardens, to creating new life, to caring for their homes and praying for the life of all the community around. And there are so many examples of this. So living in the face of the death and destruction coming, where the whole way of being and interacting is destroyed. Yet still there's the call to life and to faithfulness in the midst of this. So I wonder for us what practices might support us as followers to stay grounded and present and engaged and to act toward life and love, even in these difficult times, and especially in these difficult times. And then a final call to faithfulness. Jesus. And Jesus worked for life and love and justice in the face of death. In the context of colonial violence, Jesus knew he was heading for death himself, yet he was not caught in the fearfulness of this, lashing out and retreating, but he kept on the path of faithfulness to call forth and act for life and love every day. So if we imagine the situation then, with the Roman Empire and lots of violence around, it was a difficult context. There probably would have been lots of people responding with trauma responses, the fight, flight, freeze, or all sorts of ways that we want to protect in this context of violence. Yes, Jesus is at times pictured as upset, sometimes weeping, sometimes he did overturn the tables, all of it. Certainly he's engaged emotionally, right? He's portrayed as engaged emotionally and sweating drops of blood at Gethsemane. These are responses of the pain, but he doesn't get caught up in cycles of reactivity, but instead he continues to pray, to attend to what is at hand, to heal and draw forth faith from those whom he encounters. So I think Jesus' life and his way of living, not controlling his destiny, there would be lots of Christological arguments we could have about this, but not controlling his destiny, but walking this path of faithfulness, that this faithfulness of love and life resulted in what happened in the crucifixion, this facing of death, but living for life, leaning into life, calling forth life, even in the face of such difficulty and destruction. So how might we walk with Jesus that narrow path of faithfulness to support us in living in these times, this time of polycrisis, in a way that brings forth trust, a kind of posture of trust in these difficult days, and to stay committed and engaged in God's beloved world? I think these are such important questions for us to be digging into and really wrestling with as communities and as leaders. I close with a favorite quote of mine, and I don't quite know if it was actually said by Martin Luther, but it's a quote that I think speaks to that kind of vivid way of being faithful in the context of death. Even if I knew that the world would go to pieces tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree today. Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree today. This is a sense of, again, living and acting toward life. There's a courage that's required in it. There's also the need for community and connection required in this kind of way of being. We don't know, right? But how do we live toward life and embrace that, and embrace this as a powerful, important time to live the faith? I think we're going through this kind of fire, if you will, where faith is being tested, and how do we walk that, trusting that something new can even emerge in the face of this kind of overwhelming threat, continuing to love and to serve life. May we faithfully walk this narrow path that's before us, God being our helper. Thank you. So, questions. I wanted to stop for questions anytime.
Many times.
I've been talking too much.
No, not at all. Questions?
Or thoughts or responses.
I have one. I've got the mic. My question is, as you are well aware, there are Christians in our world who do the first 4 of the things that you talked about as faithful responses, and they almost become the same kind of indifference and denial and trauma responses you were talking about without actually engaging in the justice making. How do we help people move from the first 4 to that last one?
In terms of making sure that they're acting, that the actions for life and really engaging life. Yeah, that is the thing. There can be this, the indifference or the way the denial of the way it can play out. Oh, can we get others to do these things, right? I think sometimes it takes their relationships in their lives too, with younger folks who are really worried about things. But I don't know how we can get others to sort of do in. This is this sort of collective dissociation that's been described that some would say has allowed the climate crisis to get to where it's at without any response, right? Without any way of actually tackling it. So I think tomorrow when we talk about some of the habits toward hope, I think one of the things we're talking about is the importance of mourning and grief, right? And being able to name that and bring that forward. And I don't know if maybe that's too threatening for people. Some folks who think about that, right? Too overwhelming. Yeah. So it's this conundrum, right? Because it reminds us of our vulnerability. And so I think more often compassion is the thing that can sort of draw.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I appreciate it. I spend probably a lot less time than I should thinking about these things. And I do have a curiosity question, though. It's not very deep, but I'm wondering why the reference to God in your notes says G-D.
Yeah. I always do that and I forget that I do that. For me, it's just this sense, it's a bit of it's the idea that God references this, such a vast mystery and beauty beyond what human words can actually ever capture. And so there's something about the dash and not being the Hebrew practice of not being able to utter God's name. So it's a bit of that honoring that magnificence of God that I can never fathom in my writing. So that's where that comes from.
Anyone else? The temptation is always, come back tomorrow for the answers.
I have a question in the chat.
We have a question in the chat. Okay.
So this is from Torin. So I can go back to it. Sorry. There we go. If climate trauma leads people to avoid its reality, wouldn't that imply that climate action would be most effective among more comfortable peoples, in other words, first world? And then Torin adds, however, to my knowledge, the most radical and sustained responses to the climate crisis come from the poorest nations. How do you understand the relationship between wealth trauma and climate action?
Yeah, and some would say that there's been a whole critique, thank you for that, there's been a whole critique about eco-anxiety as a white person privilege kind of phenomenon, right? And then that's being unpacked differently in different places. So yes, and I didn't talk about climate justice and climate racism, environmental racism. The interesting thing is the writer is right that the creative things are happening on the ground where the people are most effective. They're very mobilized and doing all sorts of creative actions, right? And so there is this problem with more privileged, usually white communities and countries where we're not doing as much, right? And so the creative action. So some would say that, yeah, climate trauma, all of that, a community is there, that it's already, things have fallen apart in such disastrous ways, and they're moving through it and finding all sorts of creative ways to move through it. So what does that mean? Does that mean all of us need to you know, come to that extreme? You know, it's not an ideal answer, but it's very true. So a lot of the creative work in the way that here in the West, in Canada, to be inspired, there's this wonderful writer, Geoffrey, that is writing out of the Philippines, and some of the incredible work that some of the priests are doing there, the environmentally engaged priests are doing there, and some of the communities there. That's so creative and alive, and not facing extreme situations in terms of the companies, because they're ending up going against some of the big multinational companies. So community, mobilizing, hearing, being creatively engaged and being inspired by some of what's happening, particularly in the global stuff. In the north in Canada, there's all sorts of dislocation going on right now, and there aren't the supports in place as there should be to support some of these communities really struggling. And so that's how do we begin to do that and start to make connections and things there. But yeah, it's a really important thing.
I think this might follow on from Torrance' question online. You characterize the kind of climate trauma, eco-anxiety as a kind of symptom of alignment with the earth. Why isn't it just the opposite? Why isn't it a function of sort of, I mean, there's other explanations, right? Cell phones and technology overuse also contributes to anxiety, and you can kind of plot these things and argue about causation. But it might seem actually that it's a symptom of alienation from the earth rather than sort of sympathy in the way that animals anticipate a storm or something like that.
And I'm thinking of the kind of adaptive eco-anxiety, so that we feel it, but we're not thrown into these reactive kind of ways of ego. It's something that can mobilize us, right? So it's almost like there's this sweet spot where there's the experience of anxiety or concern, right, that we might feel in our bodies as well. It's just when it gets into that distress that it can throw us into some of those more, being more alienated from the earth and sort of, and functioning over and against the earth. So where that sort of line is of eco-anxiety, where it can be mobilizing for us to come together. So that, I think it's a tool, right? You can interpret it in different ways. But I'm sort of curious about the fact that we are so deeply earthen as human creatures that the earth's distress is known in our bodies, right? And so the fact that youth and young adults and folks who are, sensitive to what's happening in the world are feeling it a lot suggests that there's something that can be reframed. So that's a bit of a reframing of what it is. So we're not scared of the emotions that may be there, but we're able to sort of look at it as a gift as opposed to something that drives us away in fearfulness. So it's almost a way of reframing and using it as a tool to move more deeply so that we aren't sort of held at that place, at that sort of restrictive place where we're not able to engage. Does that connect? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
I watched far too many reels of the flooding from Hurricane Helene in the Carolinas, North Carolina. In the whole country there, those are deeply faithful people. And there were this whole string of TikToks and whatnots of people who would certainly call themselves Christians and be called Christians by others, explaining why this happened. And there's a very definite thread which would say, to quote someone, a woman quoted by a BBC reporter, "I think God is showing us his power." So there was not anxiety because of the nature of the faith, which was just able to lay all of that at the foot of God, and that for some reason we need to be shown, I think she said, God needs to show us that he's in charge. So I found this quite worrisome, that the faith as professed in those folks is actually preventing any feeling of anxiety, because this is seen as a sign of God's mastery of the created order. I wondered if you'd run into that or had any comment.
I mean, I think there are all sorts of theological framings that really have been, working against us, right? And that would be one at some level. Tomorrow I'll be talking a little bit about some theologies of hope that have been, actually can be understood as kinds of denials of, kind of run away from what is to some other kind of way of being, to some dreamt of future, some new world, right? That is, some would describe that as a kind of denial or avoidance response, actually, in theological form. So this is, it feels like there's something important about how we can lay our anxiety, our fears, all of that at God's feet. I think spiritually, theologically, pastorally speaking, that can be very important to be able to lay that before God, right? So that we're not alone in that, right? At the same time, to interpret it as God's mastery or God's control, reinforces this same kind of image of God as making everything happen that happens, and being the power as control as opposed to love, right? That sets it up and that perpetuates, the crisis that is at hand. So, yeah, I think it's everywhere. We see a lot of different examples of theological framings that really move us away from connecting with the earth and embracing our earthliness as creatures. You want to go in?
Okay, we'll share. I promise to pass this to you. So this might sound a bit trite or simplistic, but somebody asked, well, what can we do? And certainly one of the things that you have underlined is going to Scripture. And so I wanted to just highlight the whole practice of Christian meditation and paying attention and listening. So, yes, I wrote script on this list. And yeah, like I spent the afternoon actually doing watercolors, painting watercolors, looking at things deeply with other people and paying attention. So that would be an example. And the other thing is, I sound like a Harold Smith commercial, but we break bread and drink wine. Where do we get the bread? Where do we get the wine? So I think once again we're being called to reflect on perhaps not purchasing so much when we utilize them in churches and share sacraments, but maybe getting back to the basics. Making the bread and what's going to happen? I'm 68, so I've been through a couple of cycles. But when my kids were young, we were really into recycling, and we had those worms to eat our compost, and it's been quite disheartening lately to find out that a lot of the stuff that we separate so carefully here in Nova Scotia goes to landfills, you know. So that is a hard part of the story, I think, people are, we want to be good, and we want to be close to the earth, and we want to do the right things generally, and then we find out that what we're doing isn't getting to where...
And we're caught in so many systems,
I find that very
right?
frustrating.
Yeah.
I find that, you know, so I'm just mentioning that. So I think so in eating local food, you know, just remembering where things come from. I heard something on the CBC today about one of the worst things is how we treat animals in factory farms, you know, so just being aware of what we're eating, once again, you know, for the third time around.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, one of the, thank you for that. One of the things that the books I've read recently is Jane Goodall. I don't know if many of you have read some, and she's written a number of hope books, right? And she describes that, you know, how every act is meaningful, right? Every act, it matters, everything matters, right? And so all these actions, as small as they may be, matter, and sort of paying attention to that. She also, and I'll be drawing on her quite a bit tomorrow night, around these sort of habits for hope, you know, just takes the day-to-day very seriously, you know, as the place where we can rediscover hope in these small acts of kindness and of meaning in each day. And I think the thing is, my question would be too, how can communities sort of come together and feel inspired to come together to action and creativity? Because the challenge is when it becomes a sort of to-do, another to-do, and it sort of feels like it piles on top, it can overwhelm us too, right? So, thank you for sharing the watercolor and the meditative practices, because I think that's too, that also is a way of, I think, when I think about spiritual practices in general and how they've emerged in all sorts of contexts of crisis and trauma, you know, I think there's something very important about reclaiming and rediscovering some of these treasures of the faith and these practices that are there for connecting us with ourselves, with God, with each other, with the earth, you know, all of these different practices that we do communally.
I'm older than 68, so I can remember what I was thinking before we started talking again. When you were answering Daniel's question, when you were answering Daniel's question, you said something about youth, and it just made me think that I'm wondering if there is a relationship between the fact that our youth have found other places to be rather than the church. And also, I don't want to pin it all on the youth, because I'm finding that since the wonderful 5 years we've had of COVID, a lot of people have found comfort in their living rooms and are not darkening the doors of the church. And I'm wondering, to me, maybe the church has a comfort zone that is not present in many people's lives anymore. And I don't really know what my question is out of that, but it just made me think of it when you related something you were saying there when Daniel asked that question about, you said something about youth and their anxieties. And their anxieties, I wonder if they were within the church community and had that wider community more than they presently do, if that would make a difference to the fears.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of with the church and the sort of shifts that were happening, that have happened so much more quickly since COVID, it flashes me back again to Douglas Hall, my mentor. He describes things, going to continue to get difficult, and there will always be a remnant, right? And it's the remnant, and there's this sort of opportunity for he would say, let's disestablish ourselves as a church and open up space for things to be done quite differently, that the Spirit might be, recognized and alive in new ways that we haven't known. And I think the kind of polycrisis that we are living in now, right, and to be meaningfully present in the midst of that has the potential to bring forth some really beautiful things in the midst of that, even as there will be pain with that too, and loss of things that how we have known ourselves as churches in the past, right? That is shifting for sure, but something beautiful and new emerging as well. Which is part of what the self-protection, right? It feels safer. It's that desire for safety and No, exactly. And this is how it all turns in on itself. This is the real challenge.
I've got one last question back here because we're going to run out of time.
Thanks. Just to see some of the folks who I know have been most afflicted with eco-anxiety or this climate trauma. In some ways, what has crippled them most has been actually, well, there's the grief aspect, and you mentioned that, we'll say some more about tomorrow. But there's also, when they do try to go and get involved and try to do something, there's a very, very quickly sets in a sort of sense of despair at the willed obstinance of corporations or government policies.
Right.
And at the same time, also encountering within themselves some of the things that they learned in the school system. You should be doing your recycling. It's on you.
Right.
You got to put it in the right box. You got to make sure you turn the lights out. And it's your responsibility. Meanwhile, there's the corporations and large companies that bring buckets and feed as well.
Right.
Just whatever.
Yeah.
So what really ends up crippling a lot of folks who I've known with this is actually the sin aspect. It's actually the broken, our own human brokenness in this, overlaid on top of what we do to the environment, and in addition to that, a lot of the folks that some of the folks that did want to be more Christians, but that is, I would say, how do you deal with sin? Well, you have to repent in some way. So I would say, I'm not sure that the church has done a good enough job of calling us to repent for this particular aspect of experience. So that would be.
Yeah, so I hear you talking about sort of also potentially the cynicism or the kind of, this feeling like not only upset out there, but then also just feeling sickened by humans in general, and this kind of negative outlook on humans, and that it would be better off without us, right? I mean, some folks have that. And it's interesting. I mean, I used to feel that. I used to struggle that way, thinking, the earth would be better off without us. And that was actually Robin Wall-Kimmerer who helped me to sort of really see, the possibilities and the ways that we are invited to work with the earth, to tend and keep the earth. And she has some exquisite ways. In a way, I think it's a cop-out, defaulting to the cynicism, whatever, that's a judgmental way of saying it, but that's the easy way out, right? The courage actually is to care and to give yourself to those actions of care toward life, whatever the outcome, right? And that we can't be dependent on the outcome we don't know, but to live in that, leaning toward life, toward hope, towards what's possible, toward community, toward love, toward the ways that we can nourish life in all its forms and resist the powers of destruction. In spite of all the difficulty, right? It takes courage and it takes community, and we're so used to doing things alone, and that this is all me, right? And more, just that sense of needing to find ways to connect with others. It's easy, there's a lot of burnout among climate activists, right? And there are whole programs to support them, and because of feeling so frustrated. And then you have people like Christiana Figueres is another one who was part of the Paris Climate Accord and getting that going. And then Jane Goodall and others who have been in it for the long haul, right? And who are just able to be present to it, to be honest about how bad the bad news is, and to care anyway, to love anyway, to work toward life anyway. And I think there's something so powerful in that. At the same time, with folks who are falling and feeling cynical, how do we have compassion for them in that? How do we draw out the goodness in them through compassion for the pain that they're carrying and manifesting?
That's an amazing segue. Anne-Marie Dalton, Mary. You wanted to make an announcement about an event.
Thank you. I just wanted to let you know, as Heather says, about an event that's coming up that's actually very community-oriented, based on climate change. It's called Building a Better Present. And it's being sponsored by Faith in the Common Good, if you know that, Faithful Footprints, our Ecology Action Center, and a group that I now belong to that's formed of a number of different religions from around Nova Scotia, called SCOCAN's Spiritual Coalition on Climate Action. So on Saturday, we're having an open event from 10 o'clock in the morning until 3, with a number of people telling us how sorts of things we can advocate for. The idea of the group is to bring together a spiritual coalition of churches, mosques, temples, and so on, so that our efforts at advocacy are enhanced by the fact that we're working together. Anyway, if you're interested in this, you do have to register because there's a free lunch. I have forms here, but the best way to register is to go on the Ecology Action website. If you don't know about it, you can ask me out here, and I have a flyer here. Anyway, thank you for letting me have the announcement. I'll be around if you want to ask further questions. At Grace Chapel.
Ross Street.
Ross.
I'll leave the poster outside here for
Perfect.
with the location.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time and your attention and your prayerful, thoughtful questions. I'm really grateful. Dr. McCarroll, to be continued tomorrow evening, same bat time, same bat channel. And if you're not able to be here in person, it is online. So thank you all very, very much. And thank you.
In there, 'cause I know